Hey gang, what's going on? Hayden Crabtree here, and I got a really exciting video for you today, a really relevant video today, because we're going to talk about how climate change and specifically flood zones are impacting the nation's real estate. So I came across this article the other day on Reddit that was talking about how properties in flood zones are overvalued by $43.8 billion. And so I really want to dive into this, say how do they know that it's overvalued by this amount, and really is that going to be a big problem, right? Because $43.8 billion sounds like a lot of money, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about flood zones in general, how to know if a property you want to buy is in a flood zone, and if it is, how is that going to impact it either as a personal house that you want to live in, or more specifically, how is that going to impact you as a real estate investor trying to buy an investment property that's potentially in a flood zone, okay? So let's dive in. I'm gonna share my screen with you guys too throughout this video, give you a couple of resources you can go to, help you be a better real estate investor. So let's dive in. Awesome, guys. So let's talk real quick. What is a flood zone? Okay, so a flood zone is something that the higher ups, the engineers of the world, civil engineers, FEMA, the US government, FEMA will tell us if something is in a flood zone, has a higher risk of flooding. And essentially what this is it tells us how high up and down, in terms of if we look at hills in the world, if we look at dips like valleys, how likely that piece of real estate, that building sitting on that piece of dirt is to actually flood. So what FEMA has done is they have created different categories of how likely your property is to flood. And so the majority of the world, or the United States, is actually not in a flood zone, right? Most property you see is not in a flood zone, does not have a very likely chance of flooding to where it's so bad that we need to make note of, hey, this property has the potential to flood. And then on the other hand, some properties are in such a hazardous area that the FEMA has almost labeled it, this property is almost guaranteed to flood anytime there's even like a little bit of a slight rain. So really the importance of this is knowing the property that you're buying, which of those does it fall in, right? Because we don't want to own property that has a really high chance of flooding, because if we do that, it's going to interrupt the day-to-day, right? We can't run a business. We can't, if it's a commercial property, if it's always flooding. We can't have a rental property, a rental house, if it's always flooding. We're always having to fix issues. So we don't really want to buy properties in flood zones unless it's a very low risk chance. So I've actually owned some property in flood zones, and I'll talk to you about my experience of getting insurance on that, what you need to know, the process of actually purchasing a property that's in a flood zone, and how I determined that I didn't really see it as a big risk, in terms of, was I gonna have to deal with this property flooding, right? So what I wanna do for you guys is actually wanna dive in, share my screen right here. I wanna show you how do we actually determine if a property is in a flood zone or not. And this is gonna be a free website that you can go to, and you guys can follow along. So I'll share my screen and we'll dive in. So the first place that I want you to go was pretty much Google, and I just want you to search right here, FEMA flood maps, okay? So FEMA is a government entity that essentially helps in disasters, and they try to educate people on what's a flood zone, what's not a flood zone. So I want you to go to Google, type in FEMA flood map search, and the first thing that comes up is this right here. It should be msc.fema.gov. We can click on this, and as we can see, this is going to show us pretty much an image of the United States. And what you can do here is you can enter in any address anywhere, and it's going to show you if the property that you're looking at is in a flood zone. And if it is in a flood zone, it's going to show you what kind of flood zone it is and what the actual risks associated with that flood zone are. So let's just pull up an absolutely random address. I have no idea. So why don't we just go to like 123 Main Street in Dallas, Texas. How about that? Let's see what the property gives us. So it drops a pin right here. It's going to go to it. And what you'll notice here, if we zoom out on this map, is that it works in blocks, okay? So it's going to pull up, and the system is going to load these different blocks. If I want to look at a property over here, it's not going to load any of the data until I actually move my pin over into that area. So why don't we dive back into exactly where this is. Sometimes this computer website can be a little bit slow, so you have to be patient with it as it loads. And hopefully this may not be in a flood zone. It may be in a flood zone. We'll wait to see as it loads, but I want to show you one thing, because you could be sitting here and sitting here and sitting here, and if there's nothing, which is just a white screen right now, you go, okay, it's not in a flood zone, but it could potentially load you know, it could take a couple minutes. I've had it take a couple minutes on me. So what I actually want to do is I want to show you guys how to do this. Is you can come right here to this map image and you can hit download firm panel. And again, kind of going back to that square, it's going to download that square and let you actually take a look, and that way you don't have to wait on the computer system. So I'm going to hit download. It's going to download this in my computer here, and I'm going to open this up. And normally it gives me a JPEG, but here we go. So this will give me, and I'd have to find the property on here that I was looking for. But what this will do is this will give me pretty much a map of the flood zones. And what we can see is that most of this stuff, zone X means that there's pretty much no risk associated. So let's actually go back here to the FEMA flood maps. They have a key down here that shows you what's what, right? So this will kind of talk to you about the different areas and how much risk it has, the potential risks, and you can learn more about that on here. So as we can see right here in this special flood hazard area, we can see that this zone AE is regulatory floodway, right? So special flood hazard areas is what all of these different zone AEs are. So if we were to be looking at a property, and again, we could see that this area still hasn't even loaded over here, but I'm going to show you in a second what it does look like when it loads. If we were in these zone AEs, then we would probably have to go out and we would have to get some sort of flood insurance if we were going to be getting a mortgage on a property, because lenders will lend to you if a property is inside of a flood zone, but they want to be protected not only with regular property insurance, but they also want you to go get flood insurance. And so flood insurance is not included on your normal insurance policies. You have to do a special request for flood insurance. So there's pretty much two different kinds of flood insurance. The first is through NFIP, which is a government flood insurance. And then the other one is a private carrier. And so there are different private carriers out there who will provide flood insurance. And I prefer private because whenever I got quoted for the property I own that was in a flood zone, the NFIP, the government one, was way more expensive for the same amount of coverage than the private one was. So I always prefer to go with the private coverage. I think the company I used was called FloodSmart, and they were really, really good. So I prefer private when I can get it. But the first thing to know is if you're gonna have to get it, right? So, you know, whenever we go back and we look at the screen, if I were to be in an area that was in zone AE, like if I knew the property I was gonna buy, let's say was on, let's find a street right here. If I knew it was like at the end of this, let's say it was at the end of King Lane, and let's say the property I wanted to buy was like right there on the end of King Lane, I'd look at that and go, well, you know, man, that's an area that is in a flood zone, so I know I'm going to have to underwrite and analyze this property as if though it had, you know, flood insurance. So it was going to have that extra expense. So that's kind of how you go through and you determine for anywhere. Again, you know, I'd like for this map to load. It's being kind of slow. It's a government website, so that's what happens. But I want to show you guys what it does look like when it actually does load. So I'm going to show you here, this is a property that I owned. Whenever I was looking at it and finally let it load, I looked at, you know, when I was underwriting the property, if it was in a flood zone, and I found that it actually wasn't a flood zone, right? So this right here is what the property looked like. And what we can see, this is my subject property right here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 buildings. What I can see is most of all of it is in a flood zone, but actually part of these 2 buildings right here are not in a flood zone. So I didn't know what was gonna happen. I didn't know if I had to get, you know, flood insurance for the entire property. I didn't know if I had to get flood insurance for just these buildings and not these buildings, or, you know, half of these buildings. And what I learned was that you actually get flood insurance by the building, right? So you can have, let's say if I had 10 units on this property, and if it were to continue, say up and over in this area, well then guess what? I would only have to get flood insurance on those specific buildings. So when you get flood insurance, it ties it to specific structures. That's one thing to know. And so how you actually determine if one building needs it and another building does not need it is through a process called an elevation certificate. And so what an elevation certificate does is they have civil engineers or surveyors, people who analyze property boundaries, who analyze topography of the land, which is essentially how high, where does it dip, things of that nature. They come out and they try to understand where the building starts on the ground, and they want to tell you that and whether that's actually going to be at risk for flood or not. So whenever you have these FEMA flood maps, these are really good indications of whether your building is going to be in a flood zone or not, but these are not exactly official. They're going to let you know, they're going to fill you in a free way to understand if you're possibly going to have to buy an elevation certificate or not, which I think my elevation certificates were like $300 or $400 a building, so it definitely can add up, especially if you have a 5-unit building just like this one right here. So anyways, the process, you first want to check to see if the property you're going to buy is in a flood zone or not. You want to do this through here. And so this is a little bit more clear. Let's see if I can go to my downloads, because I know I downloaded this other one. So this is what the flood zone looked like for this other property of mine. And so as you can see, my building is right here. This is where my buildings are. And so the competitor, actually, this is for a storage property across the street, wasn't in a flood zone, didn't have to spend any money on it, but I did have to spend money on it, and that impacted the price that I was willing to pay, right? Because commercial real estate is based off of how much money is left over at the end of the day after I pay all my expenses. That's how much I'm willing to pay for it. And so I had to include in this property, hey, I'm gonna have to pay for flood insurance, right? Even though I'm in zone AE, and this is a very, very low risk area, this zone was actually the chances that it was going to flood once every 100 years. So, every single year I own this property, there was a 1% chance per the FEMA standards that this property was going to flood. And so I personally felt comfortable with that risk. It wasn't a high risk area. And I knew this property too. And so whenever I went and analyzed it, we had a pretty big hill out the back on the backside that protected us from this little pond right here. So I personally wasn't worried about it. But if you are, let's say on the beach, or if you're in a low area that has proven to flood in the past, you definitely want to know about that before you buy a property. So I'm going to give you an expert tip. Please, please, please keep this in mind. If you're going to go buy a property, that period between when you get it under contract and when you actually buy it, your due diligence period, what I want you to do is I want you to wait and I want you to analyze the weather. The rainiest day during that contract period before you actually buy the property, I want you to go to the property when it is absolutely downpouring, raining cats and dogs, because you want to see how that property is going to drain and if there's any flooding issues before you own that property, right? You don't want to find out that there's flooding issues after you own a property, because flooding issues can be very expensive to fix, both in terms of repairing the building, but also when you have to put in drainage, when you have to do earthwork and run water away from your buildings, all of that can be very, very expensive. You want to know if you're going to have to do that beforehand. So kind of going back to this central theme of how do the flood zones in America, how does climate change impact real estate investing? And so, this $43.8 billion number, let's think about that for a second. I had on my screen here, how large is the housing market? So the numbers are that just in 2020, we gained $2.5 trillion of value in the United States housing market. And so the overall size of the housing market is reported at $36.2 trillion. $36.2 trillion. So when we think about how the homes and flood zones are overpriced by $43.8 billion, that sounds like a lot of money, but in my opinion, that's actually a very small percentage, right? In terms of, hey, some of these homes may be overpriced and people aren't considering the risks of living inside of a flood zone, but in reality, we're I read the other day, 6 million housing units short in this country. So why would people want to live in a flood zone? Well, the answer is they can't live anywhere else, right? They have to have somewhere to live. Hopefully they understand the risks, but they need somewhere to live, right? And so if there's a chance that once in every 100 years the building they live in is going to get destroyed, as long as they have insurance on it, sure, that sucks. That's not the way you want to live your life, getting your home destroyed from every now and then. But the reality is that this concept that climate change is going to impact the housing market, I personally don't think it's true. I think the housing market is way bigger than this estimated, overpricing of housing. And so I'm really not worried about it. But on the same token, if I'm going to make an investment, if I'm going to, my personal house, I made sure it wasn't in a flood zone before I bought it. I always want to make sure I understand what I'm getting myself into and understanding the risks that are associated with that and having the proper insurance or financial reserves to make sure that I can accommodate whatever is going to happen. Because if I know that I'm buying a property that's in a flood zone, I want a big discount for it. If I may buy it and I may do work to it to make sure that, you know, the structures, when it does rain a lot, that I can do work and I can slope the waterway and I can put in drainage systems to protect that building, I'm okay with that. But I need to know before I actually buy that investment that that's going to happen. So this idea that, you know, the climate change and the rising of the oceans, like that may be a problem in the future. I don't think that's a problem right now. I think the bigger problem is not understanding the water drainage issues on the properties you're potentially buying before you actually do it. So do me a favor, go to the FEMA website, type it in, download that so you can actually see it if the FEMA maps don't actually load for you. Make sure the properties you're buying are not in flood zones that have a very high risk of flooding. And so if they do, make sure you're understanding the financial impacts and how you're going to have to mitigate those impacts and how that's going to impact your investment. And otherwise, you know, just know, right? Know where flood zones are, know that you're not buying in it, or know that if you are buying in it, you're protected. So I hope this video was helpful for you guys. Again, check out that FEMA, download the maps. And if you have any questions about this, about elevation certificates, about any of that, about NFIP or private insurance carriers, let me know in the comments below. I'm happy to help you guys out with any questions you have, because I have bought a couple properties now in flood zones. I've never had any of them flood because I was properly prepared, and that should be all you guys need to know about it. Check out some other videos on the channel, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a great day.